Thank you. Thank you, Dave, and all who have made time to be here. It's a pleasure to speak at a gathering where the title of the seminar is Socialist Theory, so one can be very explicit about one's politics and what any kind of academic endeavor that one engages in does to inform that politics. So let me start with that, because that's sort of how this particular book, I don't know if the little abstract was circulated, that was sort of more specific with regards to the question of the digital. But let me sort of start by explaining why I wrote this book and how that relates to my particular sort of political work. So for about 25 years now, I've been active on the Pakistani left, which is a very emaciated left. It probably speaks for the world at large, but Pakistan is particularly emaciated, being a frontline sort of anti-communist state through much of the Cold War and so on. So my particular experience of being involved on the left started off by being a very young person in the late 90s, coming into contact with an old guard, so to speak, with some, let's say, pretty prosaic conceptualizations of left politics or revolution and so on and so forth. And then transitioning to becoming sort of almost like a part of the old guard myself, with a new generation, which almost completely shifted its terrain of political work. And that was the sort of the onset of digitalization. And so really what I wanted to do in this book, or what motivated this book, was a desire to, well, first to move beyond what honestly were frustrations about getting young people to actually engage in political work beyond Facebook posts and Twitter sort of tweets. And moving beyond frustration and sort of thinking about, well, this is now the terrain upon which a younger generation of people are sort of coming into. In fact, that's how most people in our context would be exposed to left, socialist, Marxist ideas, usually, through some kind of digital social media platform. So that's the context of this book in particular. And thinking about how, using a Gramscian lens, how the hegemonic apparatus is now increasingly digitalized, and what that looks like and what that means, and how to think about this. And I do believe, more so here, when I was doing some of the background reading for this book, my sense was that this has been thought about more in Western contexts, far less so in places like Pakistan, where you have this huge youth bulge that are sort of just riding this wave of social media, and there's not a lot of reflection about where we are going with all of this. So that's sort of in a very sort of brief intro to where the book came, or how it comes into existence. And so the first sort of, in a sense, peg of the book, which then I'll sort of try and speak to, is this question of how reflection and theory then, in classic, in a sense, the question of praxis, right? How that does, or actually part of what I write about in this book is that it doesn't. And my sort of experience of it is that many of the people on the left, or broadly what you would consider, progressive forces, are engaged in what I call is like a competition of oppressions in online spaces. So, whether it be sort of classic, sort of self-described Marxist, or in Pakistan's context, a very big segment of what we call progressives are ethnic nationalists, who are constantly pushing back against a unitary state project, centered around religion, and a particular language, Urdu, which is actually, at the time of the country's creation, was only spoken by 2% of the population. So ethnic nationalism is also, so you have Marxists, nationalists, feminists, most of the times online beating up on each other. Sort of, missing the forest for the trees sort of thing. So in a sense, my, as I said, initially frustration, and then trying to move beyond frustration and actually say, okay, well, let's not sort of bang our heads on the wall about this. Let's actually think about what this means and what it looks like moving forward. So this question of praxis, right? How do we think about online and offline organizing? How do we work questions of self and reflexivity into politics? And that then, took me back to classical sort of philosophical texts, Fanon and Gramsci, and also some more contemporary stuff that's been written about this, largely in the Western context. So that's one peg of the book and what I wanted to do and sort of extend to Pakistan and broadly to other non-Western contexts, where I think questions of the digital are currently, I think everywhere they're underemphasized, but particularly in our context. Then the second related, these are all related pegs. The second peg is about broadly the question of the universal or universalism. And of course, this then brings into conversation a lot of now fairly established debates about Eurocentrism and, provincializing Europe, et cetera, and, in our part of the world, that most famously with subaltern studies and then the kinds of critiques of subaltern, but broadly post-colonial theory sort of posited, at least on the surface, as the other to some kind of universalist theories, which then I push back against in this book, also in other work that I've done in the past, and try and sort of think through more useful, in a sense, mutual, synthesis. So, it's not class versus identity, not, universal versus particular, which of course in I think established dialectical traditions was never the case. And I think a lot of that debate fell prey to overly polemical characterizations. We were just talking, me and Dave, briefly about, for instance, Vivek Chibber's book, and if I'm allowed to say so, how that argument, which potentially I would agree with, was very inelegantly put. So a lot of polemic takes the place of sort of, I think, what could be more useful sorts of debates. So in that, the politics of the universal, which is something I wrote an Antipode article about, and how to work through real existing contradictions on the ground. So for instance, to go back to what I said earlier, how Pakistan's sort of most developed, sort of in a sense, mainland area of Punjab, how to reconcile a progressive politics in Punjab with sort of the demands and concerns of ethnic nationalists in Balochistan or Sindh or non-Punjabi peripheries. And so part of this then question is not just sort of an abstract a priori question of the universal and the particular, but is also refracted through my experiences of politics and working through those. So I'll get into that as well. And that, that again, that meant engaging with, both some of the older debates on like whether it's subaltern studies or what have you, and then more useful, although still potentially critiquable, sort of fusions, like, I don't know if some of you have come across, like this person out of Calcutta, Kalyan Sanyal, has written about sort of trying to think through the question of the particular and the universal in the Indian context. And then the third thing, then the book, or this body of work that I've been engaged with over the last little while is about the actual empirics of uneven development, and for you geography people, about spatial logics, and changing ideas or notions of peripheralization. And that then looks at, I look specifically at what actually existing post-colonial capitalism looks like, through mega development projects, through big coal mining projects, for those of you who are familiar, in Sindh, in Balochistan, and then also in metropolitan centers through big gated housing schemes, which are creating new peripheries, where a particular kind of financialized suburbanization entails bulldozing squatter settlements and creating or generating surplus populations. So those are broadly, in varying bits and pieces, what is in this book, and what again, as I said, at a more molecular, everyday experience of doing politics, I've been thinking about, grappling with, working through, and trying to. Someone very rightfully noted to me the other day that I spend a lot of time writing about Gramscian common sense, but some of those political experiments also allow you to think about what good sense, what Gramsci would have called good sense, looks like emerging from those almost intractable questions of hegemonic common sense is sort of, in a sense, the deep roots of it. So let me just get to this. I'll try. I think it'll be a bit of mix and match throughout. But the question of praxis, I mean, for me, this is, I think, I find this probably the most significant part of the story, at least in the writing of this particular text, because it seems to me that there's something quite fundamental about what this new technology has done. Like all technologies, and particularly, under conditions of capitalist modernity have done, it could be the printing press, it could be the telegraph, it could be the newspaper, the television, whatever. But something about, I think, digital sort of modern, like contemporary, sort of, especially totally compressed time and space social media does, is it creates a digital public where pretty much everyone has a say. And that I think is different from, let's say, reading publics of sort of, the Habermasian public sphere, or other publics which were more like a captive audience receiving information, like a TV watching sphere. And what that means is that the self, I think, becomes the individual, sort of becomes, the question of individuation becomes even more pronounced. Even in contexts where historically, if you think about, non-West post-colony, where that process of it's been theorized like to a limited extent in any case, but at least on the surface, there's this pretension that, these are less individuated societies. And I'll leave that to a side, which I don't think is actually too accurate. But even if one does work from that assumption, I think in the last 15, 20 years, and again, this is partly on the basis of my own experience, just to take an example, I still find this difficult to work through. But so I'm associated with a political party, and for me, it's like, it makes sense. Not just the logical thing to do, but the obvious thing to do is for the party to give a statement, or to put out a position, or to have a collective position. But the prevailing common sense amongst younger people is, well, nobody reads that. There has to be a face, there has to be a name, it has to be personalized. And, you know, good or bad, right or wrong is irrelevant. The fact is that is how this is inhabited and thought about. And so I came across what I thought was a very insightful way of thinking about this. William Davies wrote this piece in NLR a couple of years ago called "The Politics of Recognition in the Age of Social Media." And it was, you know, engaged with sort of classic debates between sort of Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth and questions of recognition versus redistribution, which, you know, I'll leave to aside briefly. But the point is that this question of, you know, this, what he calls economies of reputation, start to take precedence over perhaps the content of what you might actually be saying, the political content of it. So, you know, am I going to get likes and retweets is really what matters. And in a sense, that's what one observes, right? You know, in 140 characters, you have to say something with a very powerful punchline, and maximal, seemingly, you know, very revolutionary positions count more than something more considered, and something that may have, you know, more of a sort of inhabitation in some kind of medium or longer term strategic horizon. Again, this is not, I'm not attaching any sort of normative good, bad, right, wrong to this. It's just, you know, in terms of observing how these things are playing out. And again, yeah, that's what I observed. So I was just mentioning to a friend yesterday. So for instance, to go back to Pakistan, just to give you some context. So we, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big pegs of sort of progressive politics in Pakistan throughout its history is these sort of what you can call regionalist, ethnic nationalist movements that push back against sort of the centralizing tendencies of the Pakistani state. And they have taken, and as some of you will know, of course, Pakistan is the only country in the world where a majority of the population has actually seceded from a minority of the population. The only modern nation state. So the Bengalis, which East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh, were 53% of Pakistan's population. This is quite a mind job if you think about it. And they said, we've had it, we're out. And so just to give you a sense of the long, sort of this long-running tension, this fundamental contradiction in Pakistani politics. And that then, after 1971, has reared its head with regards to the Baloch, to Sindhis, to Pashtuns. Some of you, if you follow, right now there's this massive deportation exercise taking place in Pakistan where about 2 million Afghan refugees are being kicked out. And in Pakistan, that means not just Afghans, but you know, you can very easily conflate Pashtun, Pakistani Pashtuns with being Afghans, so there's all sorts of racial profile. So there's this long-standing. Now, nationalists, they can be Baloch nationalists, they can be once upon a time Bengali nationalists, Pashtun nationalists, for obvious reasons, therefore have, you know, often very polarized opinions about the Pakistani state. So I was just, again, sharing briefly. Now, what's started happening in recent years is that you'll find a lot of nationalists who will go into exile or self-exile, whatever, sitting abroad, having extremely maximal positions in online spaces, which I may or may not agree with, that's a different matter. But what's actually happening, which I find, to come back to this question of reflexivity and economies of reputation, is that I'm sitting in Geneva, or Glasgow as the case may be, and I'm putting out a tweet or a post about how the Pakistani state is evil. And a young 14-year-old kid in Balochistan is liking my tweet or retweeting it. And within 6 hours, he's being picked up. Right? So this, for me, strikes me as a real problem about horizon and strategy. And what am I trying to achieve here? Is it to, as I say, win an online following, or is it to build a meaningful, substantial politics? And that's quite aside from whether or not I have a horizon that is sort of beyond my particular identity group. As I said earlier, because I'm also having online battles with Marxists who are talking about universalist sort of horizons. I'm also having an online running battle with, some perhaps category of liberal feminist who doesn't speak to the question of women's oppression in Balochistan. The point is, this is just a small little example of how I think this question of both self, the question of like self or individuation, and strategies, horizons of politics are shaped, or not. In fact, partly what I'm suggesting is there isn't very much strategic thinking beyond the very, very short-term sort of question of how to build reputational capital in the online space. This is not something very profound, but again, like I say, I think this is something that people on the left, people, and I think this is, I can imagine, I don't know very much, but I can imagine with sort of the experience in the UK where sort of a younger generation of people come to the left through, I believe it was called Momentum, and then the Corbyn experience, and I wonder how much strategic thinking there's been about that experience, and what new modalities of doing politics through online spaces, what sort of victories were garnered, and then what was the strategic horizon, and how these are just broader. These are not. I don't know the answer to that question, but just to give you sort of an analogy of the kinds of questions that I think are crucial to be asking. And so, and then there's any number of. I can give you more examples of how. And some of them are in the book, of how similarly how progressives are either sort of picking, I would say almost like suicidal battles with organized power, or on the other hand, engaged in internecine conflicts amongst themselves without any sort of thinking about strategic horizons. So that I think is crucial. And this is quite aside from the fact, mind you, that it is increasingly difficult to convince. And when you have economies of reputation, and you can be sitting on a screen and building up this huge online sort of, in a sense, following, you don't have to do any offline organizing. I mean, there's innumerable examples now where I'm talking about the people. The people can be my ethnic nation. The people can be, oppressed genders. The people can be, any particular segment of working, class segments, but I may never have to come into contact with them. May never actually have to go out. And I'm not just sort of putting this out there as a hypothetical or as conjecture. This is my observation of how some of these sort of forms of reputational capital are built. Often, in fact, increasingly so. And some of the book is actually dealing with what we're looking at the empirical examples of the right. Yeah, so Imran Khan. Narendra Modi is has been in power in India for close to 10 years. He's never done a press conference. He just needs Twitter. Yeah, and shock horror, if the American elections were held today, Trump would win again. Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, what digital spaces on the whole have brought is actually, if you look at a global scale, is actually the right has deployed them, and part of what the book is, and I won't get into that, but the subtitle of fear and desire are two sort of signifiers around which, digitalized reactionary politics works, I would say, around the world. everywhere. And that's quite aside, and then so that's one part of the story. And so my question is, well, on the left, people who are socialists, who think about, some kind of alternative hegemony, what are we doing? And the answer is not a lot of strategic thinking, at least in the Pakistani context, I would say. But part of what I'm also arguing in the book is that, and I'll get to that, is that at the very least, I would say that similar demographic profile in the rest of South Asia. So for instance, our median age in Pakistan is 23. We have 250 million people. 65% of them are under the age of 25. Very similar demographic profile across all of South Asia. Very similar demographic profile across all of Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is what, now and the immediate future, this is sort of the broad terrain upon which, hegemony is being shaped, and hegemonic ideas are playing out. So that's the one big piece. Obviously related to that is the question of a politics of the universal, and trying to still sort of, project a potential politics of the universal in such an environment where competition of oppressions is taking place, where maximalism and economies of reputation seem to take precedence over, other things. And that is that part is more grounded in terms of the kinds of experiences that I've been involved in, and so on, and also thinking about how that, some offline organizing is in some way the only way to forge, those kinds of universalist horizons, I'd say, because they force us to confront difficult questions of unevenness, of privilege, of how my particular, self and my particular political worldview is shaped by. So I'll give you an example, and that's what the Antipode piece was about. At the turn of this century now, actually a long time ago, close to 20 years ago, quite a long time before, in Pakistan's context, again to bring us back to Pakistan, before the Pakistani military, which I'm sure most of you will know is the dominant political, economic, sort of even shaper of ideology in Pakistan. Quite a lot before it had become common knowledge that the Pakistani military was also this big corporate empire. And it was not just a Praetorian army running governments from time to time, or a sort of outpost of the American military-industrial complex. There was this movement in the heartland of Punjab, which is actually very much the heartland of military power. Punjab, again, very briefly, was the sword arm of the British Raj, where after the turn of the century, was where most of the British Indian Army was recruited from. And so therefore, this is a very deep sociological basis for the military's power as well, right? So it recruits all its soldiers from there. And then also the biggest contiguous irrigation system in the world, which were called the canal colonies, which also supplied British industrialization from the late 19th century onwards. So the sword arm, the bread basket was Punjab, and so it has, deep, sort of, in a sense, roots of military power. And so in 2002, there was this movement on a colonial era farm, which was called the Okara Military Farm, spread out over 17,000 acres in central Punjab. And this farm was created in 1913 to raise horses for the British Indian Army, and to also supply dairy products to British Indian Army troops. And after the British left, that all of those objectives became moot because no one was fighting wars on horses anymore, and not a lot of milk and cheese was being supplied to troops, Pakistani army troops anymore. But the military kept running the farm. And they had thousands of landless tenants actually tilling the lands, and they were basically just absentee landlords. And so in 2000, this is a movement that I was a part of, and I spent a decent amount of time incarcerated as a result of. The Military Farms Administration showed up and they said, well, we are changing the tenure arrangement here, and you are going to have to now pay cash in rent on an annual basis, which then stoked fears of eviction and dispossession. And so there sort of a spontaneous movement emerged, and basically we looked into the entire sort of background of these farms, and we found, well, actually the military doesn't even own these farms, and they haven't paid any lease money to the Punjab government, which is the owner of this property, 17,000 acres, since 1933. Shock, horror. And so, it was a pretty substantial movement. And what was unique about it was happening in Punjab. And you couldn't bomb the living daylights out of Punjabi farmers like you could in Balochistan or in, erstwhile East Pakistan, because, this is the heartland of military power. And so that movement is sort of really involved in this pretty substantial disclosure about the military's excess. And in 2005, in a very different geographical terrain, in a very peripheral terrain, another insurgency breaks out in Balochistan, which is the fifth of its kind since 1947. Balochistan, again, some context, it's the biggest province of Pakistan, but by far the most peripheralized, underdeveloped. I don't really like that term, but you know what I mean. And is racked by nationalist sentiment, as I've described a little bit earlier, pretty much since the very beginning. And this particular insurgency broke out in Balochistan because the country's largest gas reserve, natural gas, and in this small little town called Sui, which had been essentially administered by local tribal chieftains in some kind of uneasy arrangement with the state. The government and the military in particular decided that now it wanted to totally take over control of these gas reserves. So there's actually like an incident of a rape of a young lady doctor in Sui, which triggered the insurgency, but what was underlying the larger conflict was the control over this natural gas. And Balochistan, by the way, has one of the world's biggest copper reservoirs, one of the world's biggest gold deposits. Some of you may have heard recently about these two mines called Reko Diq and Sandak, which are now Chilean and Australian multinationals are, their eyes are popping out, trying to do deals with the government of Pakistan over, and there's been a lot of arbitration around. But the point is Balochistan is very rich. It's a classic Dutch disease story, very rich in minerals, has this huge coastline, which now has again come into spotlight because of the Chinese-funded Gwadar port on the southern tip of Balochistan. Is rich, but as Michael Parenti reminds us, very rich countries whose people are made poor by the nexus of state and capital. So this insurgency breaks out. And so we traveled to Balochistan, to Sui, and to Dera Bukti with the leader of our Punjabi peasant movement. So this was us, in our, sort of youthful exuberance, trying to reconcile, the Punjabi working class with the colonized Baloch people. And what ended up happening was, I wrote this article called The Checkpost State. So in Sui, or in Dera Bukti, which is the district where Sui is located, there's checkposts. It's like this heavy militarized zone, checkposts at every literally 5 kilometers. So we're taking off our transport and our Liaquat, who is this guy from Okada, very close friend, but also importantly to this story, the leader of this movement in Okada, in the military farms movement, gets really frustrated and utters an expletive in Punjabi. And all of a sudden, the ranger, the military sort of personnel that had taken, suddenly their faces change and the smile breaks out. And suddenly we are no longer suspicious trespassers who pose a threat to the country and to its resources, because they're also Punjabi. And this is something that happened in British India consistently, where you sort of classic divide and rule tactics, right? You're a restive periphery, and you send troops from other ethnic and religious backgrounds to sort of, in a sense, be the face of state power, and be the face of the colonial machinery. But what it did was, it meant Liaquat was thoroughly ashamed of the fact that, well, I show up here, and because I share the same ethnic background as this soldier, I am treated, I'm given a welcome, and the people who live in this territory are subjected to this sort of dehumanizing behavior on a daily basis. And in the transport after we were let go, there was this very profound conversation. And this is just a very long digression to say, well, there's no replacement for how you navigate and negotiate these long stories of in a sense, how unevenness and state, in a sense, oppression generates difference. In a sense, how the story of capital is not of, and that's, I think, this question of universalism also comes in. It's a story of, a universal, the throne of capital is a universal throne, and it seeks to establish control everywhere through the generation of difference. But that generation of difference at a subjective level can only be combated by universalist politics if we acknowledge that difference. And I think that only happens meaningfully or more substantially when it happens in those sorts of settings. It definitely doesn't happen in echo chambers in the online space. And there's many such other examples, both in that particular article, but other things I flag through the book, which is to suggest that that is, I think, the biggest question that at least my experience is how to continue insisting, asserting, and to get younger people on the left, people who call themselves socialists or feminists or anti-whatever sort of anti-centralized or anti-state nationalists, to sit together and strategize about more substantial horizons. The last thing I'll say, I don't know how much time there I've already gone into, but either way, that I'll sort of call it a day shortly. The last thing that I want to sort of emphasize, which is a little, there's part of this in this book, is about how actually existing post-colonial capitalism tells us about capitalism in general. And that is particularly through the examples that I offer about, whether it be mega development, so on and so forth, which of course are exacerbating an already acute climate crisis. The word crisis is a bit overdone these days, but I think you can genuinely call it crisis. And of course, again, as many of you will know, it is this region of the world which is most prone. You saw what happened, what is it now, about 18 months ago with the floods, where a third of the country, literally a third of the country, was underwater. And that is just the tip of the iceberg, honestly speaking, because the longer run projections in much of the subcontinent is for desertification. because in the highlands of the Himalayas, the Karakoram and the Hindu Kush, glacier melt, permanent glacier melt. The long-term historical pattern is there's seasonal great glacier melt that sends water into the river tributaries, which goes all the way down to the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea. And that's how now over hundreds, thousands of years, those ecosystems have reproduced themselves. But permanent glacier melt means floods for some time, and then eventually no water at all. And that, of course, has been exacerbated by over-damming the big rivers like the Indus. There's two big plains in the subcontinent, the Gangetic Plain and the Indus Plain. They are both over-dammed in where the upper riparians are, and that is leading to, in fact, in some cases, that's actually leading to sea intrusion upwards in quite unintuitive ways, but that's exactly what's happening. So you have sort of salt water coming up into even 100 kilometers up past the coastline. And so, this question of mega development, and that's the last part of this book that I want to sort of talk about, which I've not done enough of so far, is the peg of some of the story is around what I call the middle class aspiration. And, many of you will know Walt Rostow, that great iconic figure anti-communist extraordinaire in the 1950s, had that, treatise, what he called a non-communist manifesto, if some of you have come across it, where he called it the sort of various stages of takeoff. And I think the fourth or the fifth stage is the era of high mass consumption. And I think that what happened, well, this is my working hypothesis, that, in the Western world, in a sense that the long period of post-Second World War, golden era, which, gave rise to a relatively comfortable, sort of, in a sense, median population, that hegemony crumbled after the financial crisis, and you had a generation of young people who couldn't expect a better life than their parents' generation, which was the first time in probably, 40, 50 years. But in Pakistan, in India, and of course the biggest sort of fable is the Chinese middle class. The middle class story is very dominant in the imaginary, at least. So for me in this book, I don't actually map or provide or offer or suggest that there is or there isn't. For me, middle class aspiration is an ideological peg of contemporary hegemonic rule, right? And it's built around this extremely destructive, natural resource intensive sort of development model, where you go out into the peripheries, you build a port, you build roads, you do coal mining, and then you set up these metropoles and strip malls and, the classic sort of urban, developed zone where, every young person can lease a car and buy a plot in a gated housing scheme. So in a sense, that is what I think is shaping the what I call the politics of fear and desire, which is what right-wing iconoclasts everywhere, from Modi to Imran to and of course I don't want to suggest they're all the same, because even the social formations are different. The particular manner in which the rule of capital plays out is different. But Turkey and Erdogan, you can go further east. There was this guy in the Philippines, Duterte. There's all types, and they all sort of pitch a similar kind of imaginary to this notional young middle class subject. And that for me, is where the story starts and where it ends. That is the subject in a digitalized terrain of politics that I think that the left has to be able to acknowledge. Now, what do we do about it? How do we, sort of, go beyond a very hackneyed sort of what Fanon would call bourgeois life world, and project something. Interestingly, I don't know if some of you know, Deepesh Chakrabarti, which, as I was writing up this book, Deepesh Chakrabarti of Provincializing Europe fame, has written, has now come back, and as one of the major sort of representatives of subaltern theory, has actually started talking about a universalist politics again, under the shadow of climate sort of catastrophe. And that tells us, and that's happening everywhere. It's happening with global history. That's happening with a lot of disciplines where people are, the universal and, sort of a larger question of how to think about politics is back on the horizon. But how do we do that in the face of this idealized middle class subject? And that, I think, is really the big question that, of course, I'm sort of knocking on the door of. I don't have an answer to, but really what I wanted to do here was to provoke further inquiry, further, take this quest further by thinking about the broader empirics within which this is playing out, thinking about the larger theoretical terrain that we've been navigating over the last 20 years, and then thinking about, well, online, offline, and moving beyond the sort of sense of, well, I wish it were different. It's not about wishing it were different. It's about thinking about how to shape an alternative hegemony within that context. So I'll stop, and then hopefully there's people who would like to challenge, engage, question. Thank you.
Thanks, Aasim. That was fantastic, and huge number of issues to chew over in question and engage with. So, any questions? Chris, do you want to start?
I'll try to be as concise and coherent as I can, but what you said reminded me of a conversation I had with the head of the Communist Party here in Glasgow. He said that last year sometime, he tried to engage with Extinction Rebellion, and their response to him was, "We're not interested in politics." And at first, I was like you, or like any good leftist, I was sort of troubled by that comment. But since then, I've thought more about why someone in that organization would think that way. And it occurs to me that, they grew up, I imagine most members of Extinction Rebellion grew up in a time where capitalism was really the only revolutionary ideology. It transformed societies around the world through both violence and non-violence, and it did so in a way that made sort of politics and elections, what have you, incidental to the kind of more asymmetrical, things it was doing in order to get its way. And digitization perhaps leveled the field, if you will, a little bit, in that the people who were at least not for or somewhat against or critical of capitalism could come in with their own asymmetrical tactics, could in a way, intensify the kind of creativity that they were able to put together in fighting against, the financiers and the theocrats and everyone else who pretty much runs right-wing politics. And with an understanding that, structures and trade unions and political parties and politicians, getting up on television and all this stuff, doesn't really matter. That really isn't what makes a difference. What the capitalists have figured out is that you have to go below the sort of surface, and you have to change, you have to completely reshape the way that business is done. And you have to continue to do that. And so you sort of start that momentum and just, things kind of always go your way because you're creating the conditions constantly for the way things are run. And so, yeah, I mean, there is a kind of anarchic logic in saying, well, we don't want to be part of any kind of politics or political structure or political organization. It's not the same as saying we don't want to address real social problems. It's just that we don't hold the same conception of ideology and politics as all of you old fogies do. We look at this thing differently because we come up in a different world. And maybe there is something to that. As like you, I'm still puzzling out where exactly this goes, but I think maybe they are onto something. And I think it really does speak to all of these, you mentioned Trump the other day and the speculation that he would win if the election was held today. I don't know if that's true. I mean, we've had all these shock elections over the past year and a half in the States, somewhat here in Britain. And that may speak to something else that we can't quite grasp yet on what is going on in these digital spaces and how they aren't just places where people go to let off steam anymore, how there could be some real organization here and some real coming together of what we perhaps would deem political ideas or political movement, but we just don't have the language for it yet. And we can't quite wrap our minds around where it's going within the framework that we're used to thinking about these things. And yeah, I mean, I sort of put that out there as a response to, to some of the comments you had.
Should I? Yeah. No, I mean, I think my feeling on this is that, yes, for sure, how, as I said, the self that is motivating someone going out there, and certainly even if they're not part of some organizational collective, they obviously have an opinion, they have something to say, and they're contributing to this hegemonic sort of battle, right? One way or the other, conscious, unconscious, what have you. I actually think my point is not to, as I said, not to lament this or not to wish that it were different. My point is to think, well, if we start inhabiting this as the way it is, then, from now in, 15, 20 years, then our organizations moving forward, whatever they look like, will center this way of thinking and doing, right, in ways that they currently don't. Like I said, the example I gave, and mind you, it's not as if social media spaces have not contributed to progressive iterations of politics everywhere. They have. Yeah? The point is not black or white, but the point is, on the whole, I still think that there's far more reflection, I think, that called for to be able to, let's just take an example. I am firmly of the belief, and I imagine this is the case in places or amongst groups that have already moved along, that our political organizations on the left, socialist organizations, people thinking about transformative politics, have to have programmers in their organizational spaces. It seems self-evident to me now that in ways that I wouldn't have thought was an obvious thing to think maybe 10 years ago, but it seems self-evident that as surveillance becomes, more pronounced, as, smart technology and machines structure our lives, any kind of transformative politics has to then center the ability to know, to be knowledgeable about these systems. So the point is to say, okay, well, I think we're quite far behind the 8 ball right now, and our whatever organizational, whatever the collective looks like moving forward, these are going to be, I think, or need to be, of fundamental importance to our collective thinking. So there's certainly not I agree in a sense with what you're saying, that whatever is happening is sort of should inform what tomorrow's sort of, more considered or more hopefully strategically meaningful political horizons look like. That's what I would say.
Thanks for that. It's really case. I think to speak partly to what Chris was saying, and into this a bit as well, is that I think it might have something to do with like that really crucial term that you use in the subtitle of the book of desire. So like one of the ways that what Chris is talking about there is that capital no longer needs to, in the same way, incorporate radical demands into itself. It pre-corporates them. We are already, from people born kind of in the 80s onwards, we're kind of already inserted into capital at the level of desire. This is really standard kind of Mark Fisher kind of 101. If anybody wants to talk to about that later. But that all that to say is, I wonder how you're conceptualizing desire within the book.
Yeah, it's a signifier. It's not deeply conceptualized. In fact, the only thing that I say about it in any meaningful way, or at least sort of some kind of taking any kind of notional debate about it forward, is actually, I talked about Chakrabarti, and Chakrabarti in his recent book called Climates of History, I think it is, or something like that, writes about anti-colonial desire and sort of recuperating some idea of anti-colonial desire. And I think this is important, right? Because, a lot of the post-development literature is also, I think, taken us to a point where we can't imagine a development or a desire or a materialist sort of horizon, futuristic horizon, in ways that I think we need to be able to do, right? Because this young middle-class subject has aspirations. Now, are they, purely within the, there is no alternative sort of framework of the world, or can there be a way of us thinking about, well, especially in our parts of the world, right? People want to have housing. People want to have transport. People want those basic material sort of, they want those needs. Now, needs, desires, luxuries, all of that becomes very blurred. So I haven't really, except to gesture to the imperative of actually taking this seriously. And in a materialist sense. Now, there's a whole set of other sort of potential debates about desire, which are more intimate, that I haven't, that are not really what I'm talking about or addressing. But no, not as such. I mean, a lot of the things in this book, as I say, are it's like a primer of the types of things that I would like, and I hope that can be interrogated further, can be deepened, rather than, I've gone full Monty and actually really explored it in the ways that, as you're suggesting, would be good if we did. But anti-colonial desire is definitely something that appeals to me as some kind of way of bringing large numbers of people together around, some kind of shared idea.
Sam?
Thanks. I just wanted to challenge the point about social media having a lot of potential power. I'm thinking about the example of like Jeremy Corbyn and the kind of politics of reputation that were invoked there. It wasn't actually through social media that his reputation was ruined, it was more from traditional media. And still thinking about very powerful figures like Rupert Murdoch. Are we actually seeing any kind of shift in the power centre of traditional media to kind of social and digital media, or does it actually still remain with figures like Rupert Murdoch, for example?
Yeah, no, I mean I mean, it makes sense to ask that question. I think that there's, I'm not sure that it's so easy to draw a distinction. So if look at the work around what people have called platform capitalism, right? Like, if the model of social media is clickbait, which it is, generally speak, and that's not to take away from, as I said, the possibilities of like us using any technologies, capitalist technologies, for also to be using them as in disruptive ways. But what I would say is that the broader logic of social media increasingly, I mean, if you look at people who are familiar with this, you know, that I was in, someone in Liverpool the other week was telling me, well, you know, back in the day when there were blogs and there were other kinds of, you know, open source stuff, and increasingly it's, you know, that has been squeezed out of the story. And more so. So in a sense, what I would say is, if you're saying traditional media, like big corporate media houses, shaping the narrative, or, you know, casting Corbyn as an anti-Semite or what have you, which of course his own party did sufficiently as well to make his life miserable. But yeah, and I would say then that it's not such a clear dividing line between what so-called the corporate media or traditional media is doing, and what sort of at least the dominant narrative that is shaped on social media. Now again, I can't speak so much to, let's say, in England, but if I was to tell you the example of Pakistan, just to take some examples, like, so for instance, Twitter, let's take an example. Twitter is largely liberal in its content, largely. So most of the commentary, or the dominant sort of commentary, will be of a liberal persuasion. Now, there's different publics. One of the things I talk about in the books, for instance, TikTok is the largest growing platform. And TikTok is a very, what I call a lower class public, digital public, where you have, you know, more content that is political in potentially progressive ways. So I certainly it's important to, as you say, to look at what social media may or may not be doing vis-a-vis what you're calling traditional media. But my feeling is that on the whole, you know, with significant exceptions, that the general trend, and that's why I mentioned like these Twitter iconoclasts, you know, like a Modi or whatever, what have you, or even Imran Khan. So Imran Khan is by far Pakistan's most popular politician, and they are, at least in part, because of what social media has afforded them. So yeah, so it's a hegemonic apparatus. We should definitely use it and think about using it, but my argument is just that the horizon should be a bit more sort of medium to long term, rather than just here and now.
Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
I have something, but I would rather somebody else say, just so if anybody else has anything, go before me.
That's fine. I'm not really familiar with the Pakistani case, but I did research on India as well as some Turkey on social media platforms and governance. And it's clear to see that the ruling governments have been dominating social media platforms. I agree with your point on leftists to have more voice on social media platforms. But when there are laws and regulations in place that challenge critiques, as well as the fear and self-censorship that pushes them to practice more, go for chilling effects, is it really possible, safe and secure, to be a leftist and kind of making your voice on social media platforms? An example from Iran, even though there were some activists who did challenge Iranian regimes, they ended up having cyber attacks when they were abroad. So even though if you're away, whether you're at home or away, it doesn't really take away that risk. And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, on the one hand, I would just say, I would urge some historical sort of context here. I don't think that engaging in any kind of anti-establishment left socialist politics has ever been without risk. no matter whether it was, when there was no such technology available to voice views or now that there is. So that's a general, sort of question that people on the left have always confronted. And partly what I'm trying to say is that, again, I mean, it's hard to know exactly how to put it. I don't think the question is not to take those risks in calculated ways. But partly what I'm saying is to think about a little bit further down the line. We don't always have to post stuff. That's partly also what I'm saying. Like, I can imagine, to go back to some other, maybe hearken to what you were saying. For me, like, the idea of some kind of, sorry if this sounds hackneyed, but some kind of underground Leninist vanguard that doesn't post everything. At some point, as a collective organizing strategy, I think makes a lot of sense to me. At least for us to start thinking around those lines. You understand? And that could mean all sorts of things. That could mean you have a face that is public, but the idea that I put everything out there that I'm doing as an organizer doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't seem logical that, that my idea is, let me have a meeting and photograph it and put it up. If you follow what I'm saying. Like, I could get it that you have to do that also. You have to engage in that battle and to put and to try and have a voice. But I don't think, my experience suggests that that's not a sufficient horizon. That's not the only thing that our politics, when we're thinking about online spaces, should be doing. There must be, for me at least, feels like something else that accompanies that one tactic, if you know what I mean. So, and that includes exactly what you're describing. How to strategize about risk, how to think about, what and when not to, and without sort of the not being purely dictated by fear or purely dictated by the fear of repression. And of course that's, from what I've observed over the last few weeks, is a very alive and well question right now with Palestine and what people are putting up or not putting up, and who is doing it, and so on. But I do think my point is to say that all of this is more effective, all of these questions, if there is more collective sort of reflection about it. And that's a longer term challenge. Maybe it never happens that way. Maybe our ideas of what collective organization look like moving forward will and are continuing to evolve in them. I perfectly agree with that possibility. So yeah, to just the original point about reflexivity and about all of these questions, because you're absolutely correct. This is what these spaces also make you more easy to be surveilled. That's basically what that tells us, right? That what you're doing, where you're going, what you're saying is now more and more accessible to organized state power. I mean, this is like a bonanza for intelligence apparatuses, is it not? Like, in a sense, that's also something we should be holding in terms of our strategic horizons. And that includes, I agree, assessing what and how to do it without being cowed by fear. And I think that balance is always easier to work out if it's not just you doing it on your own, and if there's some kind of collective logic at play. So what that looks like is of course contextual as much as anything else.
Isha, and then Manas, yeah.
Should I go first?
Yeah, you go first, and then Manas can join later. Yeah.
Very quickly, I just wanted to ask you a little more about the politics of the universal and what that universal looks like. And clearly, it cannot be the universal that, it's not monolith, but what kind of collective or universal politics can we think about within this context? Because here, anyway,
Yeah, in the book, I've again, sort of possibly as a provocation as much as anything else, I write about, or I use this term called the classless subject. So classless, for obvious, well, at least for me, for obvious reasons, because the imaginary or the horizon of a classless society is still very appealing to me. But classless also in another sense, because the classless subject can be a feminist subject, the classless subject can be a subject that is, committed or a particular nation seeking self-determination. For me, that's an idea that allows for a universalism, while also centering, more and more the kinds of concerns about identities that have informed our contemporary, I think, generation of political workers and activists, which they do. Now, how is that effected in practice? I think has to be a collective, organizational at some level. I think that there is something to be said for how, again, these are mostly Western experiences, but they've certainly had their effects in Pakistani progressive spaces, like the experiences of, let's say, Occupy and horizontalism and leaderless movements and so on and so forth. I mean, whether, and also not just Western spaces. The 10 years after the Arab Spring and so on and so forth. I think there is some reflection, right? That that the idea of an organization, is it necessarily to be rejected for being hierarchical or bureaucratic? So that's one part of the story that would inform what our universalist politics looks like, which is a bit of recuperating some kind of collective organizational logic, whilst also being able to, as I said earlier, reconciling those who are talking about class, also those who are talking about identity, and that's, I think it takes it takes real world examples to see, well, what does people's politics look like? So, for instance, right now I think is a pretty eye-opening moment. Again, from what I've gauged, I'm sort of an outsider, but having been here for this time, there's like Palestine, the question of imperialism or Zionism is a very vexed sort of contradiction for some people who might otherwise be very committed to questions of class and so on and so forth. So these are deep, complex questions. But for me, the idea of a classless subject, because for me the book was, what I was trying to do in this book is to say, okay, what does the subject of politics in this digitalized age look like? And taking into account the real existing sort of everyday within which we work. Like I say, everyone is wanting to be middle class, everyone is aspiring to a particular kind of lifestyle, and so that's the given. And how can we then move that idealized middle class subject to something towards a more universalist, some kind of revolutionary horizon? So it's just a sketch. Mine is just a sketch, and obviously it takes form in particular contexts. But I still like the emphasis on some kind of organized collective form, I think is without that, I think then you're just hoping for the best, that people come together somewhere along the line, along some shared principles, which they do, but then they don't also, right? So that's a never-ending sort of hope, which I think needs to be refracted in some way, and that can only happen through some kind of organizational modality.
How much time do we have? So these are obviously things that people have, movements and theorists of social movements are thinking about all over the world. There are some fundamental issues. And as you said, you're trying to think about the formation of the revolutionary subject under current conditions. this is not exactly, I have 2 points, they are not exactly challenges, they are kind of like different ways of looking at the arguments that you have set forth, and I want you to comment on them. Because I have found 2 contradictions, which might be answered in your book if one reads it more coherently, but I would just like you to talk about this. So first of all, it is not entirely true that social, and I come from a perspective where I'm intensely critical of social movements, as an ex-organizer also. But it is not entirely true that social movements are only reproducing the logic, this performative logic of like, I will upload everything online, etc., etc. And there are various social movements all over the world which do organize underground in this sort of spirit of the underground Leninist vanguard that you mentioned. However, the problem that they have, and this is especially true with like black bloc formations, etc., especially in Europe, and in general groups that engage in illegal activity, they have to be underground. The problem that they have is the problem of translation. So, coming back to previous sort of anarchist early 20th century approaches of propaganda by the deed. We will do this. It will create a mess. We will rapture the hegemonic sphere by doing something completely outside the logic of normality, and then we will give our leaflets, we will give our manifestos, and people will become activated. The problem that these movements are facing now is exactly the fact that the language, the sphere of the intelligible, is not accessible anymore to the majority of the population. So what you seem to suggest from your latent critique is that we need to move away from or not focus exclusively on the sphere of social media, and go more directly back to, physical organizing, and also in a way that is more sort of security conscious and etc., etc. But this does not resolve the problem of translation. The fact that even if you go down, which some groups are doing, the words, the language, the issue of hegemony is not anymore that it simply has closed off the horizon. The issue of hegemony right now is that what we are saying in this room is not intelligible. So there needs to be extra steps there, and I wonder what you have to say about that. And connected with that is the issue of, because you sort of proposed a sort of Leninist organization as a sort of nucleus for this new revolutionary subject, if we manage to create it. Leninism is premised on this idea of democratic centralism. This is the only way that the Leninist organization can function. However, democratic centralism itself is a product of the Industrial Revolution and of the specific subjectivities that were associated with this collectivity. Are you following me? Which is directly the contradiction. It's directly the opposite of the subjectivity that you are describing exists right now under the digital sort of world. So how do you resolve this contradiction? These two questions are connected, but yeah, I think that they are fundamental.
Yeah, no, great questions. Yeah, translation and intelligibility, I agree with you. I think that, again, I don't know, I hope that I can clarify this like definitively. The point is not either or, certainly, yeah? I think you did hearken to what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that social media is to be eschewed or it's not a terrain to engage with, none of that, not at all. I just think it's insufficient. So necessary but not sufficient. Or in the book I called it digitalized resistance is necessary but not sufficient. Just quite because resistance itself is necessary but not sufficient, not to say digitalized. So that means yes, deploy it, communicate ideas in a language, and that includes, I talked about TikTok. TikTok is not just, it's not even like a spoken language. It's like videos and songs. And that's why why I call it a lower class public, because it has such resonance without it requiring the literal, literateness or literacy as such, yeah, formal or otherwise. So and I have great respect for friends, comrades who are online and who are, popularizing ideas in ways that are, as you say, intelligible. So this is not either or. That's the first thing. The second thing that you described about the Leninist vanguard, I think probably the last comment I made was a bit, that's not to suggest that that's what I'm insisting on. The only thing I was hearkening to there is the notion that there has to be, for me, again, both spheres. So for instance, if I have a presence on social media, if I am out there as, engaging in the everyday public sphere, contesting ideas, propagating my own ideas, our ideas, what have you, in ways that, as you described rightfully so, incorporate very many different identities, has an openness to it, while also projecting some kind of shared universal idea. That is one, as you say rightfully, that is, at least at the level of popular hegemony, is an engagement that is required so that we're out there, so we exist. But in the longer run, and this is why I'm saying this, for me, it's like about medium and long run horizons also. For instance, questions of surveillance, questions of any kind of ruptural strategy, not necessarily the anarchist strategy that you referred to, but any kind. I don't think that needs to be put out there in public, all of it. That's all I'm saying. I'm not suggesting a classic vanguard party as such. I'm saying that some of what you do politically, your organizing work, I think certainly it's not part of that part of what the story that you've rightfully described that you're doing to engage in terms of the ideas in public. It's about how, 8 of us in an organization, or 10 of us, or 15 of us, or ideally thousands of us, are doing the everyday work of organizing. Or what I refer to Michael Denig, who writes in a Gramscian vein about orchestrators, very interesting use of the word of orchestrating. So I agree that, and mind you, having said that, that's not to say that some kind of organizational structure with however more or less hierarchy, whether you call it democratic centralist or not, and I totally agree with you about how that particular model of political organizing corresponding to a particular age of capitalist development and industrialization, which, mind you, in the non-West we've never reached that age, so to speak, in any case, in the same way, in any kind of teleological way. So there's certainly no attempt to impose a model of organization upon a social formation, which I've also hopefully tried to communicate is itself very uneven in any case. It's just to suggest that this particular unreflexive modality of going out there and projecting everything, that's all I'm hearkening to here, rather than an absolute, this is what our model of organization must correspond to. Yeah, and potentially if you go through the book, you'll hopefully see that.
I was wondering if I could pick up on that unevenness point, actually, because one of the things I was interested about, both reading the book but also hearing you talk, is that question of how uneven geographies of online and offline politics interrelate. So the sort of invocation of particularly anti-unitary state politics in Pakistan, I think, how from a left politics, how do you articulate that in a kind of solidaristic way in terms of thinking about a kind of universalist politics? Because I think that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Like Fanon talks a lot about hate at the deep sort of level of embodying hate, right? And the question of how hate in very polarized colonial contexts becomes embodied. And that's why I gave you that example of like a Punjabi, peasant leader, ostensibly, thinking, well, I'm pretty oppressed, and then realizing, oh, just the fact of being Punjabi gives me privilege in this even more peripheralized and even more oppressed and, in a sense, colonized context. And so, again, I don't think there is a way to do this. I don't think there's a modality that resolves the question of how to engage in solidarities. I just think that for me, what I'm wary of is if it's just performative, as opposed to sort of something that one inhabits while recognizing that these contradictions exist. Not just I have to post something or I have to express an opinion in solidarity with. I think it's also it's to recognize, well, I get why if I am from a more developed and sort of integrated part of the country, and therefore my identity is politicized in this way, I get why this person who historically views me as the oppressor, I get why they're so pissed off. And I follow that, and I inhabit it, and I engage with it. I don't, it is real, right? It's not just something to be either, just sort of, in a sense, superficially, performed about one way or the other, or dismissed, or whatever, which I think that my concern is that is often how political opinions are increasingly expressed, right? In a sort of more superficial way than I think sort of engagements, in a sense, face-to-face engagements entail. Now, that's not to say you always have face-to-face engagements with everyone you ever express solidarity with. Of course, in fact, you don't. And those are also very powerful expressions of solidarity, like, for instance, what we're seeing right now, where large numbers of people in the world, despite the complete complicity of their governments, are out. They might not have anything ever to do with Palestinians ever, anywhere. So those are powerful expressions. But, I'm also aware, like, in a sense, perhaps, I don't know, but from my recollection, there were even bigger public expressions of solidarity in 2003. Yeah, and the question is, and that's actually why I asked the question, and someone at the back also, hearkened to this. But it would be interesting for me, just as an observer, to say, okay, well, all of that as sort of when you think about all of that coming together and the kinds of politics that it gave rise to, whether it be the anti-war protests and then later on post-financial crisis, sort of expressions of politics. And for me, as an outsider, like, the culmination of that is maybe like Bernie and Corbyn, for instance, right? At least some kind of at a macro scale. What other things come of it? I mean, that is the kind of, I think, reflection that I'm interested in thinking about or calling for. And that then, I think, deepens the prospects of solidarity. Otherwise, like, the time-space compression of our world is like what was urgent yesterday, today nobody even remembers. That's also part of what is happening here, right? Like, it's literally day to day what I'm expected to express and it's strange, actually, because the more active you are, the more there's an expectation of, like, half the time, again, in Pakistani progressive circles, like, the criticism and accusations are, well, you didn't say this for me. Why are you so I'm expressing solidarity with someone, and the first thing I'm hearing is, well, how come you didn't say this when it was my turn to be expressed solidarity with? So I haven't even expressed solidarity that I'm now defending myself against ostensibly another ally's attack. And that then tells me that there's something amiss here, right? Where it's, like I say, where the other dynamics are over-determining something more substantial. And yeah, that is what it is. It's just, how do we work through it? And yeah, that's what I'd say to that.